Sure. Well, to talk more about, I think, the ongoing escalation, the implications of, the way the U.S. is using its military power, we are very, very honored to be joined here by Mike Prysner, who is himself a veteran of the U.S. military, host of the Eyes Left podcast, and producer for the Empire Files, also someone who's been on the ground in Gaza. Mike, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you've seen, what Middle Eastern wars with the U.S. can do up close. And I wanted to ask you first, I mean, we obviously don't know what's going to happen, but with this huge, saber rattling going on by the United States, there's a possibility, obviously, of a regional war and a major war in West Asia. I mean, could you talk about what the implications of that, could be, how dangerous it really could be for that kind of event to take place?
Yeah, well, first, I think it's important to point out that, it looks like it already has developed into a wider war, in a regional war. There are a large numbers of attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria, 38 just this past weekend. Some of those in Anbar province, which was very bloody for the U.S. during the U.S. occupation. Around 50 American soldiers have been wounded. It's beefed up troop numbers in those countries. It's expanded combat operations, expanded frequency and reach of patrols. And then you have American forces bombing several bases in Iraq and Syria 2 weeks ago. And then again, within the past 24 hours, bombing bases in retaliation for the retaliatory strikes and so on. And the purpose of those U.S. strikes, the Pentagon has framed as, quote, not an escalation, meant to send a message to the militias in Iraq and Syria that if they don't stop attacking American forces, they will be attacked. Well, in each of those strikes, attacks have only continued and, of course, increased after the first strikes. Joe Biden was actually just asked by the press, getting onto his helicopter, if he believes the retaliatory strikes are working. And he said, yes, they're working in the sense that they're hitting the intended targets. So if Israel is waging a war, waging a genocide, and then the U.S. and other militaries start killing each other over that, I mean, what else can you call that? A regional war has already begun, a wider war has already begun, where Washington is willing to kill a lot of people and potentially sacrifice its own soldiers so that Israel is able to conduct a genocide. But right now, it's a low-intensity war. And so the question isn't, is a regional war going to start? The question is, when will it escalate, or will it escalate from a low-intensity regional war to a higher intensity one? And how much bigger it could possibly get. And so the question of the implications, right now there's about more than 45,000 U.S. troops in the Middle East. That includes secret bases and a secret unknown number of troops in both Lebanon and in Israel. More are being sent as the U.S. braces for more attacks. And I think if you want to, think about what the implications are, it's look what the implications of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were. And those, could potentially be lower in intensity than the potential for bringing in Iran and Hezbollah and other, setting the whole region on fire, basically. And so I think what we're seeing here is, the Pentagon is doing these strategic reorientations because they think that it's possible for a much larger regional war to break out. So we don't need to guess. We know that they're preparing for it. And it, who would suffer from a war escalation? It won't be anyone in the Pentagon. It won't be anyone in the White House. It will be, as it was in Iraq and Afghanistan, American youth sent for a criminal mission based on lies and civilian populations that they are set upon. So Washington is really recklessly playing with fire, but this is what they do because the risk to them is incredibly low and they're never held accountable when it blows up into disaster. And I think finally I'll say that I think this danger is so real and the major implications of another quagmire for the U.S. Is so real. It's like you're seeing all this dissent within the State Department. And I think that, it's not because all of a sudden those people developed a conscience. And so I think that they believe it's against American national security interests, quote unquote, national security interests, which means they see the potential for this blowing up in their faces and becoming another inextractable crisis like they were in Iraq and Afghanistan, which they worked so hard to get out of and then pivot to Asia, which they are now in a way is reversing.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And, I think there's a parallel between the US and Israel in so many ways. I mean, you have Israel, this massive, oh my God, the most powerful military in the region, demonstrating that it's having a very difficult time, right? Dealing with this, group of these soldiers, these Palestinian soldiers of different Palestinian resistance factions across Gaza, operating out of a death camp using homemade weapons mostly. Sometimes you see these videos where they're like wearing sandals, and the Israelis are like having a difficult time actually fighting them. I mean, they're really good at dropping bombs on babies. But when it comes to actually fighting them, they just kind of hide behind body armor and tanks and rely on air power. And so far, it's been over a month and they're still like not able to really take Gaza City, which, is what their ultimate goal is, right? Now we go look at the Americans across the region. And I mean, another element of this is this idea that the US can just control everything with its superior military power. But Mike, we saw in Iraq, we saw in Afghanistan that all of that, high tech, expensive equipment really couldn't do what they said it could. In both those situations, you can't really say the U.S. won. So I guess the question is the arrogance of U.S. power also on display here?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, Israel rolling in just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tanks and armored personnel carriers. They hope that technological superiority can do what they want to do, which is conquer Gaza. Essentially, I mean, their stated mission is to eliminate Hamas, which could mean a very long war for them. But of course, yeah, throughout history, in particular with the U.S. military, we do see when overwhelming military superiority doesn't win a war, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq. But I think what the U.S. does accomplish, even though the U.S. could not win those wars and was essentially defeated in all of them, they did succeed in crushing the countries. And so, yes, a determined resistance force with not much. And a lot of these videos, pretty much all the videos that the resistance fighters have released from Gaza, they have no huge explosives like you'd see in Iraq, that could actually take out a tank. You're seeing smaller explosives that can disable tanks. And so they're still fighting with relatively small munitions. I mean, smaller than the Iraqi resistance had at this point. So yes, I mean, Israel can easily get locked in a quagmire that they can never win against a determined resistance, despite the fact that they have U.S. weapons and funding and just an unlimited supply of tanks and things like that. But they can succeed in turning Gaza to rubble. And so, that's why the front of this war that is the American people in particular demanding a ceasefire and disrupting business as usual, as we're seeing all over the country today and all over the world, that needs to be emphasized as much as possible, because yes, Israel could very well lose in Gaza, but it can succeed in doing what the U.S. did in Korea and in Vietnam and in Iraq, and that's lose after devastating the country and leaving it destroyed for generations.
No, I think that's a very, very apt point. It's sort of like if they can't totally destroy you, they at least try to leave you maimed so that you won't be able to, have a decent life. And, one of the other things I want to ask you, Mike, is if anything at all, if you've heard, from active duty service members, reserve people who could be called up about, how they may be feeling. I mean, I think we know in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, service members themselves turning against the war played a major role in the opposition. And I just wonder if, you've picked up any chatter in that regards.
Yeah, I'm in touch with several people in the Guard and in the active duty who, since all this popped off, are exploring their options for getting out. I think in a way, it's reminiscent of the assassination of Soleimani by Trump and the kind of gearing up within the military of, okay, all the units got to start getting ready to go to war. We got to trade in our old equipment, get our new stuff, cancel our training missions so we could be on standby for deployments. There's then definitely been National Guard units that are being put on notice and being told to prepare to go somewhere. And so once that happens, I mean, and before, all of this started, you weren't really faced with those real questions once you joined the military, like, oh, am I going to have to go be part of something serious? And once those moves start being made and it starts to become very real, your decision to join starts to become very real. And you really have to think about the implications of what you've done and can be part of, coupled with the fact that, the military in so many ways is just a cross section of the U.S. population. And what we're seeing in the U.S. population right now in regards to Gaza is the Israeli narrative has mostly shattered and has nothing near the hold that it used to have on the American public. And that's why we're seeing historically large, unprecedented demonstrations in support of Palestine. That's not just from the Arab and Muslim community, but from a large swath of Americans, really a cross-section of the American working class. And that's represented in the military as well. And so all of the American people who are suddenly waking up to this situation, and this being their wake-up call about what things are really about, of course, a portion of those are people who are in the military, and then have to think about if my unit's the one that's getting sent to Iraq to bolster U.S. forces in Iraq so we can be hit with rockets and drones by forces that are punishing us for supporting a Gaza genocide, is that really something I'm willing to die for? Or if something bigger does break out and it becomes a more open, the U.S. is actually defending another front of forces that are trying to disrupt what Israel's doing. These are real questions that service members are asking themselves right now. And just in those that I've talked to, it is becoming a wake up moment for many of them. And so, if any of them are watching, there's something called the GI Rights Hotline. You can look up and explore your options. And then also over at Eyes Left podcast, we have a resources there as well. And so this should be a moment for people to question their role in the U.S. military. And quite literally, the role that the U.S. military is playing now. Rania, you mentioned a deployment of this yet another, warship, a nuclear submarine, in addition to 2 aircraft carriers, which, those are ships with fleets around them. And the U.S. only has 11. It sent 2 of them to this region. No other country in the world has more than 2 aircraft carriers. Russia has 2 aircraft carriers, or 1, and China has 2. Like, no other country has that many aircraft carriers. And the fact that 2 are sent to the region, quite literally, what the U.S. military is doing, from the seas to the Air Force to its forces that are in the Middle East, is to protect the back of Israel so that it may conduct a genocide in peace. And that, of course, is no cause worth killing or dying for anyone.
Yeah, it sounds crazy when you put it that way. Mike, I know that you've spent time in Gaza. Empire Files did this great film called Gaza Fights for Freedom, which everybody should check out if you haven't already seen it. It's available on YouTube to watch for free, and I think also on Vimeo. But, I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to add about the situation there, having been there at one point and now watching this place that you visited just be obliterated.
Yeah, I mean, that's tough because most of the people we worked with on the film in Gaza, our camera operator, we've lost touch with him for several days, and he was in the north, and we had been in regular communication. Ahmed Abu Artema, who is the main organizer of the Great March to Return, who we collaborated with closely, he's in the hospital. 2 of his children are in the hospital with severe burns. His young son was killed. Our co-producer for the film, his house was destroyed, and he's a refugee yet again. And so it's in the context, it's looking back at that film and the people we worked with to see that everyone has been impacted by the war that was a part of it. I think that from what I've got in my experience of being in Palestine, both in Gaza and the West Bank, working on that film and getting to know people working through the blockade there, is, there's, of course, Israel has made it through conducting a genocide that just living is an act of resistance. And there's a real determination to not give up and to live. And I think of all the horrible videos that are going around and that everyone is, of course, watching and is moving people to take action, the one I saw that impacted me the most was a man being pulled from the rubble which has got to be like the shared common experience of people in Gaza, right? If you live in Gaza, you picture yourself, what am I going to do when it's me that's trapped under rubble, possibly days from being rescued? Like, how am I going to keep myself together? How am I going to endure what that is going to be like? And that shared common nightmare of this is something that may happen to me. I might find myself buried alive under the rubble for who knows how long. And it was a man being pulled from the rubble by a rescue team, and he gets pulled out, of course, looking like everyone else does, pulled out cheering, and the crowd just erupts in cheers. because just living is an act of resistance. Surviving the Israeli bombs, every survivor is a blow to Israel, and that they can win by just surviving and living. And victory will be, every survivor is a victory. And so I think that spirit and determination, what Israel wants to do is take it all over, and that even in the face of such horrors and such a nightmare, the determination to not leave, to not go away, I think is very strong, and it's not going to be given up by anyone there. And it's going to be a long and hard road, but I think that they're capable of doing it, and we have to do what we can to help.
Mm-hmm. Mike Prysner, host of Eyes Left podcast and producer for The Empire Files, who, among many other things, produced the fantastic film Gaza Fights for Freedom. As always, thank you for making some time for us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you, guys.